Good morning, everybody. We're going to get started. My name is Greg Hodge. I'm serving as the Interim Executive Director for the Executive Alliance for Boys and Men of Color. And I want to welcome you to this conversation and hope that you are safe and healthy wherever you are today. As we're in California, where I am in Oakland, we're still sheltered in place, although we're still starting to come out. We have a wonderful conversation planned for today. Under the theme of connecting our work, strengthening our communities, a long overdue conversation and set of conversations around the relationship between the girls and women of color work and the boys and men of color work. And we've assembled a great set of thought partners to have that conversation with this morning. As we get going, I want to invite you to just consider wherever you are in the country, if you're outside of North America, wherever you are, that the land that you are likely sitting on is Native American land. And that land here in Oakland, California, where I live, the Ohlone people lived here before the interruption of European conquistadors for hundreds, if not thousands of years, in relative harmony with nature, managing the forests, fisher people, and growing the crops that they needed to sustain themselves. And so we always want to acknowledge our Native American brothers and sisters in this work. Often the invisible people, often people who are embedded in urban communities as well as on the res, but we want to acknowledge them. We also want to take a moment just to acknowledge our ancestors, all of us, wherever we come from, have ancestors on whose shoulders we stand, ancestors who struggled in their own ways, had joys and successes and a range of all the human experiences, and that because of them, we are here. And this morning, I want to bring into the space a couple of ancestors. Breonna Taylor, first of all, a young sister who lost her life to police violence, police-sponsored violence, murdered in her bed, with no one being held accountable in Louisville, Kentucky. And for our friends from Louisville, you know, our energy is with you, our hearts are with you, you know, keep up the good fight for justice and fairness in Breonna's situation, her case. And I've also been thinking a lot about, as many of us have, about James Baldwin. I think about James Baldwin as someone who had a pretty sharp and clear critique of America, a sharp and clear critique of the possibilities of America as a gay Black man who had to leave the country for his art and live in France for 17 years. But people like Baldwin and that generation continue to inform our work, continue to inform what it is that we're doing. And so for Baldwin and for Breonna, and for a lot of other people on whose shoulders we stand this morning, I'm gonna ask you to just take a breath and we'll just breathe together. We got to do more self-care. All this sitting in Zoom meetings is not healthy. So if you can stand wherever you are, just take a deep breath, inhale, hold it for a second, and exhale. So inhale, and inhale for Breonna Taylor one good time. Inhale. And exhale. And one last time for our children who are yet to be born, children who are coming into a world that we will surely have to make better. For those children and their descendants, we inhale one time. And exhale. Thank you. It's good to have friends on this call, folks who have been doing this work for a while. We're going to start the conversation with a little bit of discussion about how do we get here? How do we get to this place that we are with the girls and women of color work and the boys and men of color work, where often we have not sort of yoked our work together. We have not aligned what it is that we're doing. So as we get into this, we want to think about like where did we sort of start? Where did this work? How has this work in both parts of the community emerged over the last couple of decades? And to help us with that conversation, we have two amazing leaders. The first, both of whom I've known for a long time, and I appreciate the friendships. Dr. Monique Morris, who is the Executive Director of Grantmakers for Girls of Color. She's an author, an educator, a filmmaker. Last year, her film Push Out got a lot of critical acclaim. And she's also the founder of the National Black Women's Justice Institute and a mom, and probably, although this is going to start an argument with somebody, probably the biggest Prince fan that I know. And so we want to welcome Dr. Monique Morris to the conversation this morning, as well as another friend, somebody I met in the early 90s when he was at the County Cullen Beacon Center, may have been PS 184, if I remember it right, in New York City. He is the executive director, or CEO, excuse me, of the Campaign for Black Male Achievement, and he's been in that role since 2008. He helped launch the Executive Alliance for Boys and Men of Color, the Young Men's Initiative in New York City, helped launch the MBK, my brother. And with the Harlem Children's Zone for many years as a director of their, I think, nutrition and health programs. He's a proud dad. I think my internet is getting a little shaky this morning, and a father of 4 children. And so I want to welcome.
Great, but that's okay. Go ahead.
What's that?
I said I was going to ask you to start all over, but that's okay.
Oh, well, I will if it went out, because Shawn, I see now. I'll give you the informal introduction, which is Shawn is a good brother. Shawn has been involved with the Harlem Children's Zone. He was instrumental in starting the Young Men's Initiative in New York City, and has also been the CEO of Campaign for Black Male Achievement since 2008. And so I want to welcome Shawnda and Dr. Monique Morris to this conversation. Good morning, y'all.
Good morning. Thank you.
Good afternoon here.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, wherever you are. Good afternoon. Yeah. So I want to start the conversation, and maybe one way to start this is a little bit of the personal journey around this work. And I know when I was thinking about this and preparing, one of the moments where I feel like the conversations around the boys and men of color work started to come into some kind of shape. And there have been lots of moments. This has been work in one way or another we've been doing since we got here, in many ways. But the young men's and boys' work, when I think about Joelle Taylor Gibbs and her work in 1984, it was a book that influenced a lot of us and influenced the field. And sometimes in ways that we had a conversation that we didn't necessarily agree with what was being said. But this was in that era of the super predator myth that came out of during the Clinton era. And Dr. Gibbs wrote a book called Young, Black, and Male in America, an Endangered Species. And for many of us, the title was a bit of a provocation because we didn't like, as Black boys and young men ourselves, I was in my 30s at the time, didn't necessarily want to be called an endangered species, didn't want to be labeled in that way. Around a few years later, when Black Men, Obsolete, Single, Dangerous by Chi-Ante came out, it was another opportunity to sort of think about where we are. And interestingly, the title of that book, the subtitle is The African American Family in Transition. And so Haki was already sort of thinking about like, how do these pieces of this work sort of work together? I was working as a consultant at Urban Strategies Council in 1991-ish, and doing some work around the status of Black boys, and got a chance to talk to Jeff Canada in New York, which is how I met Shawn, Chi-Ante in Chicago, Yusini Perkins, who was doing a lot of gang prevention work at that time, and others around the country who were trying to inform what was happening with Black boys during that period. And this is at a time where programmatically we were doing freedom schools. So the freedom schools work came out, and that was for boys and girls, came out of the Children's Defense Fund. Urban Strategies Council was one of the regional coordinators of that work. We had sites around the country. Oakland Fund for Children and Youth was created in that same era, where we set aside resources for youth development for young men and young women around the city. And so for me, much of it, and as we got into later years, the 2025 campaign for boys and men of color that was being run out of 21CF and AAPI, those are sort of, for me, sort of places where I think I began as somebody in this work to engage around the work of boys and men of color. So I'm just curious, Monique, for you, and then Shawn, for you, like, how do you think about the history of this work? How do you think about the moments where this work was happening? Because I have to say, last thing I'll say before I ask you, Monique, to comment, is that, when things are made visible, they tend to get attention. And I think that in part, what was happening was that what was going on with girls was not getting attention around research and data, was not getting attention in the narrative, generally. So as I've been thinking about this a lot in terms of how did we get here, those are some of the events that sort of shaped my thought. But Monique, I'm curious for you, like when you think about how this work gets to where it is now, what's your sense of that?
Thanks, Greg. I think for me, this conversation really started in the 18th century. I think of Black women scholars who were writing, in the 1700s about the particular and unique struggles of Black women and girls, the erasure of those experiences in many ways in public discourses, and the ways in which the struggle to be seen in various ways, has been very prevalent in our communities, even as Black women and girls were leading many of the movements, often as Black women and girls were engaged in constructing many of the frameworks that we use to talk about conditions in our communities. And I think we were living with a scenario where Black women and girls were simultaneously highly visible, but also, that the great visibility on the front lines of many of our movements and behind the scenes and organizing in many of our movements sort of led us to this belief that the women were fine, the girls were fine. There were a lot of conversations, sort of fast forward to that were happening, maybe 10 to 15 years ago, that echoed much of that sentiment, where there was a growing and deep investment in the conditions and needs of men and boys of color without there really being a commitment to talk about this using the framework that Kimberly Crenshaw has given us around intersectionality, that Sojourner Truth gave us when she asked, "Ain't I a woman?" That we needed to explore not just the data that were presented to us, but we needed to ask harder questions of ourselves and our community if we really wanted to be whole and well as a community. For me, there was a smattering of programming that was happening around the country. I described them as sort of popcorn programs that were responding to some of the unique conditions that were uniquely impacting, girls and women of color. But the issue was really that in order to address, I'm going to start off out the gate a little harsh, but just, I got to tell the truth. The reality is, that a lot of the conditions that were impacting the girls and women meant that we had to reconcile some of the harm that was happening within our communities. And that was really difficult to reconcile with the work when we're trying to establish a need for there to be a rigorous investment without pathologizing Black malehood. And so, I think the difficulty around those conversations led for, many investors in this work to say, let's silo conversations, let's render a certain community, or let's put the harder conversations around the complex trauma as it's manifesting in our communities on a back burner, which led for there to be many candid conversations that I was having with folks in philanthropy about the need to invest in women and girls, and being told, this is important work, but it's not our priority. You are not our priority. The prioritization of harm in many ways led to, not just an invisibility, but a pseudo hierarchy of pain that really didn't reflect what was happening in our communities. And even in that space, so many of us were willing to say, okay, we'll stand with the work that's happening around men and boys. And I always felt that was a worthy investment, always. I just felt like we needed to also be in a space where we couldn't do that work to the exclusion of women and girls. And if we were gonna really build community, then we need to, really fast forward and advance and grow the investments that we have to make in order for that to be, something real, something tangible. So, I think with the growth of Grantmakers for Girls of Color, with the convenings that were taking place to cultivate space within philanthropy and the many organizations that came together and advocates, I was one at the time that, sort of pushed philanthropy to say, let's do something different, let's do something better. We have to put some money into this, work, into our belief that girls are worthy of investment. It was really more than a research theoretical, sort of intellectual exercise, and really, something that, so many of us just labored to make happen.
Yeah. Monique, thank you so much. And Shawn, I'll just get you in the conversation as well. Like, from your vantage point as somebody who's been doing this work for a while, how do we get to sort of where we are?
Well, I think, and thanks Greg and for the intro, and Monique for really aptly setting the table, and Executive Alliance for bringing us together, as you said, Greg, for a long overdue conversation. And as Monique, I think, highlighted and emphasized, that it shouldn't be a both and, either or, but a both and conversation. And I appreciate the historical context, because when you ask the question, how did we get here? I'm like, well, do we start with Nat Turner, or do we start with Emmett Till that we were just talking about? Do we start with Rodney King? And so for me, and you asked on a personal note, for me, this work began on September 25th, 1962, that when I was born, a Black boy to Deanna. And as I think about where we are, because I think it's really important that we highlight in this conversation today, we're talking about how did we get here, but we should spend ample time on talking about where are we, right, in this moment. And I think we talked about during our preliminary calls, this opportunity for us to, one, dream together, this opportunity for us to figure out the possibilities together. And Greg, you described and talked about when we first met, when I was running a Beacon School in Harlem in the 90s. And I know for me, an inflection point, because even at that time, in the early 90s, I was just doing community building work, right? I did not say that I am doing Black male achievement work. And that's another interesting conversation we can have, in how the language and the framing from Black male achievement to boys and men of color, there's like so many layers that we need to, peel. But for me, it was like the Million Man March that really elevated in a huge way a targeted focus on Black men and programming around Black men and what we were going to do, one, as individuals, but also looking at systemic racism and the plight of Black men. I would also just lift up that this moment for me when I joined the Campaign for Black Male Achievement, and moving up to that, I think it's really important to lift up that, as we know, this work did not start with us and it will not end with us. Bobby Austin and his work at the Kellogg Foundation in the early 90s, in 1992, and I think later I'll put in the chat a link to a timeline for the Black male achievement in boys and men of color work. I think for where we are now, for me, I think another inflection was joining the Campaign for Black Male Achievement in 2008. I think it's important to note when we look at this timeline, the work that Bobby Austin was doing in the 90s in philanthropy. It was like this sole voice in the wilderness in the Kellogg Foundation and trying to get attention to this work. And it was exclusively focused on, Black men and boys, right? And black boys. The Urban Institute did some research and looked at some 51 promising programs that were focusing on black boys. They did that, I think, in 1995. And then in 2005, we took another look and found out that only 25% of those organizations still existed, right? And so when I think about where we are now, and it's a couple of, I think, inflection points over the last 12 years with the Campaign for Black Male Achievement and our partners. But I think of 2006, even before the campaign was launched, there was a meeting, an AAPI meeting in Seattle, when folks like Lauren Harris, Alvin Starks, Susan Batten, Taylor, came together, looked at some research and some data. It was around that time, this infamous article in the New York Times cover story, the plight of Black men deepens, elevated this conversation in philanthropy. And I think it's really important to note that when we look at this work, even when it was launched at the Open Society Foundations, folks weren't rushing to raise a flag for Black male achievement. there was a conversation at the foundation that said, well, aren't we already engaged in Black male achievement? Look at our criminal justice fund and how much we're investing in criminal justice. Very important work, yes, but this was an opportunity for us to invest on the front line. And one of the things I think while it's important to have this conversation is, sometimes, and this often happens in philanthropy, when you raise a flag for one thing or one issue, folks automatically assume that you're against another issue, right? And so the way this is, how Monique described this, from the very beginning, we were invested in and siloed. And money is funny, right? Money is funny when you don't have it, and money is funny when you do have it, right? And even in philanthropy, one fund's gain is seen as another fund's loss, whether we're talking about Black male achievement, immigration, democracy and power. And so I just think that this opportunity now, and so before I turn over, there's a couple of inflection points I just want to lift up. And, I lifted up folks like Alvin Starks, Erica Hunt, with the 21st Century Foundation, Ron Mincy, John Vaughn, Rashid Shabazz. When I was at Open Society Foundations, on the board was Brian Stevenson, Jeff Canada, and Sherilyn Eiffel. And I sat back and watched how their ability as board members to shift resources, there wouldn't have been a scale up for the campaign for Black male achievement. And so I think where we are now, and we have an opportunity to again come in this space where, I think of someone else, Marcus Walton, right? And I'm gonna end this opening right for a second. When we first launched this, the campaign for Black male achievement, Marcus Walton was working for AAPI. He said two things to me. He said, one, you need to approach this work as a one-term president, right? Take risk and just act like a one-term president. And the second thing he said to me was, the challenge with this work is that we don't trust each other and we don't trust ourselves. And he was just talking about within the Black male achievement framework, he wasn't even talking about an intersectionality conversation. And what makes me excited about this is the opportunity for us to build trust. And Monique, I'm just going to end with one story. So Monique was part of our first grantee convening in 2009 when she was at the NAACP, and she was part of this. We were in Miami, our first grantee convening, and there was tension in the air. What is the campaign? Who is this leading the campaign? Why are we here? What about women and girls? And we had an opportunity. I don't know if I was creating it, but I was feeling some tension from Monique, right? And so we had an opportunity to go into small groups, one-on-one sessions, and we picked names, and I picked Monique, right? And so I sat with Monique for an hour, right? And I don't even remember what the conversation was at the time, right? And she could tell her version of it, right? But in that conversation, we got an opportunity to get to know each other, to hear each other's stories. And at the end of that hour, and even each other's vulnerabilities, right? At the end of that hour, I was like, wow, where was this perceived tension that I was feeling with Monique, right? And I think that where we are now is emblematic of that relational opportunity for the intersectionality, and where do we go from here? And what does the Venn diagram look like with all the work, and where does it intersect?
Yeah, I'll just know we're at time. I just want to quickly say that I think part of what our opportunity is, and maybe this will help, Greg, with your transition to our next phase of this conversation, is just that, ultimately we've seen the investments and philanthropy as a tool. And as Shawn was saying, especially when we understand money as funny, right? And I think, what we have to do is understand our capacity to steward resources as an act of justice, and recognize that justice is as infinite as there are possibilities, right? Justice, we can't divvy up. It's not a pie, right? And so if we think about our instruments that we have available to us, the conversations, the framing, the relationships, the opportunities to connect, that's when we then get to the place where we can push ourselves to be a stronger, bolder community.
Mm-hmm. And Monique, one last thing before I invite our other thought partners into the conversation. That vignette that Shawn shared, I mean, what was your sense of it in that moment, that time, that first convening? Was that a moment where the trust started to get built a little bit better? Was that a moment it was still somewhat anemic? Like, what's your sense of that? Because I'm very curious from your perspective, at what point did whatever tensions, whatever that was in the field, began to either dissipate, or did it just lie fallow? Like, yeah. I'm just curious from your perspective about that time period.
I mean, my perspective from that time was that was a very necessary convening. And I think it shaped a lot of my understanding of how philanthropy was going to be constructing some of the narratives about wellness in our communities. I think I left that convening both proud of us and also recognizing that some of us are brave, right? To borrow the framework of the Black radical feminists who understood that in many of these discourses, all the Black people are men and all the women are white. And so where does that leave the rest of us? Some of us are brave, right? And so I think, it has, in various ways, individuals, like I have always felt confident in having conversations with Shawn and Marcus and Alvin and others who have been, deeply entrenched in this work. And I feel family, when I have these conversations. At the same time, I recognize that not everybody is as connected to that. And so some of the tensions remain. And when the resources are distributed in a way that, really represents or reflects an underinvestment or an underappreciation for the value of girls and Black girls and young women and other women of color and girls of color, then we start to see the alignment of resource allocation with those values. And so I think there's still a lot of work for us to do to cultivate an alignment, or an actual alignment of resources with stated value. But I remember leaving that feeling like, this was such a rich conversation, and it was such a rich opportunity to heal. I think what was beautiful about that convening was that the emphasis was on healing. And I remember Shawn saying, even at the first space, that we were there together, saying, you're not going to work. And everybody there was a workaholic, right? So everybody who's doing work is like, what do you mean? I don't have time to rest. I don't have time to have conversations with you about this. But recognizing that the conversations that we're having with each other is part of the work. And so often when we're in this kind of community building space, if we're in, at the time I was not in philanthropy, but, depending on what role we're holding at a given moment, healing has to always be at the center. And that's why I think that, I left that conversation, both proud of us and also very clear that we still needed to engage in some work to represent those who were not present in that space and conversation.
Cool. That's really helpful from both of you in terms of this history and how we do the storytelling around this work. How much of this perceived and real tension has come from philanthropy, sort of either intentionally or unintentionally pitting different issues against the other. When you say you don't have, that's not our priority. Well, saying it's not your priority is not an answer to the question around what is really needed and how do you partner with folks like Monique and Shawn and others. I want to bring three other of our friends into this conversation. The first, we're going to bring them all in at one time and ask you for your response to a bit of this history of what you've heard and how you're thinking about this from your vantage point. So the first person I want to introduce is Connie Connie is the co-founder of Asian American Pacific Islander Women Lead. as well as Transformative Research, where she's an advocate, a researcher. She has helped in one article I saw, politicizing sex work, and she serves as an adjunct professor at Mills College here in Oakland. So I want to welcome Connie. I also want to welcome Shawnda Chapman, who is the director of the Girls Fund Initiative at the Ms. Foundation. She has served as the director of Beyond the Bars Fellowship at the Center for Justice at Columbia University. She's a parent. She's an amazing sense of humor. Not that that's why we brought her today, but she's very knowledgeable about this issue as well. I want to welcome Shawnda. And then lastly, Chi-Ante Singletary, who is with the Cypress Fund, where she serves as the best title I've heard in a long time, Chief Reparations Officer. And she has she is an advocate. She grew up in the Gullah community in the southeast part of the U.S., attended Spelman College, and also works with Solid Air. And so I want to welcome Chi, Connie, and Shawnda to the conversation. And let me maybe start with Shawnda. Like, what's your and we'll go Shawnda, Connie, and then Chi. Your reaction, response, observations about the little bit of storytelling we've done in terms of the history of this work. So let me start with you, Shawnda.
First of all, hello. I really appreciate the opportunity to just be in conversation with these really brilliant people, to have a reason to put on lipstick and, other articles of clothing that I don't regularly wear anymore. So thank y'all for that. I appreciate it. This is a hard conversation. It's one that, here's the thing. It's difficult. I'll start with what makes this an easy conversation. The easy conversation is that I know that everybody we're talking to want boys and girls of color to win and to make sure that they have all the things that they need. And so that as a starting place sort of, it makes me feel safe. It makes me feel like I can bring my whole self and all of my thoughts to the conversation. And so I'm just going to do that. But part of what's difficult sort of in this conversation and in our social movements kind of broadly is that we have a difficult time with the intersectional nature of oppression. Like, we have the language down, we have the frameworks down, but we continue to really ask gender to take a back seat. Like, we're literally still struggling with this. I was watching sort of as we sort of moved through the whole sort of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor experience. And I remember like just literally being furious, like jumping up and down, sort of screaming at, how we transformed sort of say her name into say his name. And I was like, we are still doing this thing, right? Like, of course, we support sort of justice for our brothers, but like literally in a moment of life and death, we don't have any real attention to sort of the like, that was a whole very gender response to the sort of invisibility and the exclusion of state violence against sort of women and girls of color. And this is in the movement. This is not by people who don't know any better. And so it's a thing that we just do it, and we got to do like better. Especially, for girls who, as we know, for cisgender, transgender, and queer girls of color, they really do live at the intersection of multiple systems of oppression, including white supremacy, patriarchy, colonization, and quite frankly, unchecked capitalism. We also know that they face tremendous sort of social and structural barriers, including policing, interpersonal violence, institutional violence in, schools and homes and communities. And more than that, like they have and they continue to face significant barriers, like educational achievement, economic and political inequality, and they're really, the recipients of really deeply embedded racial and gender biases in the media and public policy and philanthropy and research. But right now we're in a moment of a bit of a correction. And a lot of this is because of the advocacy of women of color, like Monique, like Kim Crenshaw, Connie, like Chi, we're actually actively doing this work every day. And people are really starting to understand in a deeper way the need for the focus on the needs and experiences of girls of color and the communities that we come from. But we have to work really, really intentionally to make sure that we don't continue to perpetuate that exclusion, that we don't sort of shift the balance sort of in the other direction. And part of that, I think right now, is to think about sort of, you know, what are the ways that we are at once responsive to gender, and that we transcend gender as well, especially through an examination of who we're continuing to leave out of that conversation. And oftentimes that's trans girls of color, that's non-binary youth of color, and that exclusion and that invisibility has deadly consequences.
Thank you for that. I want to ask Connie to weigh in the conversation as well.
Okay.
Hey, Connie.
Hi, I hope folks can hear me.
Yeah.
Thank you to the organizers for bringing all of us on board, and thanks for the attendees for making time to be a part of this. I'm happy to join you all. I thought a little bit about the question, and there are so many amazing points that you all have made that I kind of want to follow up on or add a little bit to. When I think through, you know, the history, you know, I think through one of the questions that we've thought through, which is, you know, how did we get here, right? And we have to think through the issue of the construction of gender by white heteronormative standards, right? So we kind of got here even before philanthropy in this current iteration took place, right? So the nonprofit industrial complex, which folks by now should have heard of, right? Which is the kind of reproduction of, you know, the nonprofit industrial complex reproduces gender in white heteronormative standards, right? And so when you know, Ms. Chapman talks about the exclusion of girls from, you know, philanthropic conversations or even the fight against state violence, it's not incidental that when you exclude girls of color, Black girls in particular, Black trans girls in particular, you're reproducing the violence of this apparatus. So I'm gonna go back for a second. If we, again, all agree that the apparatus we all live under is anti-Black, white supremacist, which are two different things, anti-Black, white supremacist, heteronormative, transphobic, right? At the very least, then we have to understand that the non-profit industrial complex, philanthropy as it used to be, all reinscribe that apparatus or that structure. It serves it. Right? So the nonprofit industrial complex can't be removed from its relationship to prisons, its relationship to policing, its relationship to, you know, child protective services, or, you know, the welfare state that was also anti-Black, or foster care, or schools. It's all of the same kind of apparatus. We happen to be one of the tentacles. Right? So when, you know, Dr. Morris mentions what happens, you know, during, you know, kind of the first iteration of abolitionist work, we're seeing that it's not coincidental. It's structured. It's a part of a continuum, right? So our job is to resist that versus reinscribe it. Our job is to not obey the terms by which the state and the nonprofits, industrial complex, philanthropy, we can't reproduce what they said is gender. What they said was gendered violence. What they said is racial violence. The hierarchy between, you know, boys versus girls is not coincidental. It serves the white supremacist anti-Black state. We have to actively resist that. Right? By questioning, you know, why did you determine that that's what, you know, boy means? Why do you get to determine what girl means? And subsequently, why do you get to determine that boys get served first and girls afterwards? You know what I mean? So I think that's important for us to think through. I think through, you know, you ask another question about, and I don't know if you want to hint to that in terms of how do we resist it, you know? But I just wanted to share that kind of history. And always at the center of the work that we do, it has to question the role that we may be consciously or unconsciously reproducing state, white, heteronormative, anti-Black state kind of their prescriptions for us.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, every step of the way. And that's what I think, you know, we kind of have failed in the nonprofit world because it's so alluring and the tentacles are so ingrained, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then I also
Mm-hmm.
think through, you know, some of the anecdotes that I have where I have friends, you know, men of color, Black men in particular, and then, you know, Latinx and others who are like, well, if you keep having this conversation around gender, you're just dividing us. And I'm like, actually, no, you're dividing us by not allowing us to have these conversations and to question how the state has determined who we are and what we get to be. You see what I mean? So I think that's really important. And then I, you know, just to wrap it up really quickly, and as another anecdote, I really love and do work with an organization called California Coalition for Women Prisoners, and I also love and do work with Survived and Punished. And one of the things that CCWP or their members have kind of helped me to understand, especially folks who are inside women's prisons that are women and transgender nonconforming, they'll say we can't resist or we don't resist the police inside the same ways that men's prisons facilities do. They're immediately, like, the violence against them once they resist is atrocious. So when I talk to the men like who resist and the male organizers inside San Quentin, for instance, they'll be like, we would have never gotten punished that way. We would never get punished that way. That's unexcusable. Right? So I want us to really think through, and especially think through, you know, Black women, Black girls, trans folks, gender nonconforming, who sit inside these cells as a point of like departure for how we understand what we're supposed to be doing. So I'll just leave it there as
that's great. Connie, thank you. And we do want to get to that place in a moment around, so now what? Like, how do we shift that paradigm? If that's, you know, that is important to do. How and in what ways will that happen? Let's get Shawn in conversation. We've had some technical problems. Hopefully everybody's back on audio minimally this morning. And for those of you who are watching and hearing this conversation, please put questions in the chat box, and in a moment we'll get to a question and answer period. But Shawn, when you hear this conversation as an advocate in your community and around the country, like, what comes up for you in terms of this piece?
Man, it's so hard to follow all of these amazing and brilliant folks and all the points. And I was just sitting here like, yes, I agree with that. Yes. And I think so much about audacity, right? And it's like, folks in power have the audacity to do so much things. They have the audacity to lie to us when we clearly see something that's happening. They have the audacity to apply for jobs that they know they're not qualified for. They have the audacity to do all of these things, but we in this community don't have the audacity to say yes and more. Right? It's like, yes, do fund my work because this thing that I work on is incredibly important. And I can situate myself as someone who advocates for Black women, girls, and gender nonconforming folks. And there are other people in our community who also deserve money and who also deserve support and who also deserve spotlighting. So we need you to do yes and more, right? Because they can do more. So one of the things that this conversation really holds on for me is that we do get the opportunity and have the audacity and the courage to ask for more, to create more space, not to recreate the silos that folks are exhibiting to us. Not that makes us not highlight the things that we're working on, but talk about them in community. We know that Black women and women of color do not live in homes by themselves, right? That they live in homes that include Black men or that include men of color, that include gender nonconforming folks, that include trans folks, and that we live in community with each other. And when one person gets help, everyone gets help. But we have to talk about exactly what's happening, I think, in the household overall. The last thing I'll just kind of add is that something that feels so important to my work because I'm Southern based. I'm like on Waccamaw Island right now. I think so much about the ways that Indigenous folks are really excluded from these conversations or are often not lifted up in these conversations. The ways that, you know, gender nonconforming trans Southern folks are excluded from these conversations, are not able to show up in this space. And I think, you know, as we're continuing and building and thinking about what could have happened, where we can go, how we can build much more intentionally, what does it look like to make a much more inclusive space and a much more inclusive pot that allows us to say yes. And I also want to talk about this community. I also want to add in this dynamic. I also want to add in this layer and make sure that we're also seeing each other in those other bodies of work, like immigrant justice, like reproductive justice, like in the work that's going out for improving schools.
Yeah, thank you, Shai. And let me ask the three of you, and actually all of you. We get everybody back in the conversation. Shawn and Monique, everybody, Connie, and everyone. Where do you all see it as we talk about this notion of intersectionality? Where do you see the challenges? Like, how does, you've already identified some of that, but where do you see sort of the big challenges as we think about how we move forward? And I want to put that also in a frame. Monique, you were very helpful in this a while back in a conversation that we were having with some folks in philanthropy around the difference between intersectionality and solidarity. Like how, like those two things are related but very distinct ideas. And so as you all have sort of talked about this, you know, and I want to get us to where might, as Connie, you put it, where might a shared analysis start to emerge around not just sort of, you know, gender conforming, but the gender non-conforming folks, our trans family. Like, how do we get past some of the challenges around the intersectionality and minimally, in my opinion, have solidarity around our respective work? So let me, Monique, let me get you back in. Anybody who else wants to comment on that piece, we can just kind of open this up. And again, we have a Q&A box and chat box. If you have questions for the panelists, please, you know, add those now.
I think if you engage intersectionality not as a theoretical exercise, but as praxis, then that can lead to the acts of solidarity that can move us beyond the siloed grant making, framing, competitive nature space that we've been in for too long. I think so many examples of structural bias and ongoing systemic oppression have been already elevated in this conversation, that were we to respond to those conditions through participatory methods that invite us to, you know, more deeply construct new realities, you know, then we would move to a space where we're no longer talking necessarily about differentiating terms, but really thinking about how we engage in practices that really do the best for our communities as those communities are leading us to do so. You know, I think so much of this has to do with the way that we have, how people use power. You know, I think there's a lot of interrogation around power. Our ancestors have interrogated power. You know, some of my favorite quotes come from you know, James Baldwin around his examination of justice with power. Just ignorance allied with power is the most ferocious enemy of justice that justice can have. And then Martin Luther King thinking about power as, you know, being at its best when it's doing everything to, you know, sort of disrupt acts of injustice or acts that stand in the face of love. And so I think, you know, ultimately what we're asking, you know, to take place, and I think where we start to engage in a new path forward is to do some critical work unpacking how we have negotiated power, how there are those in our communities that still are rendered to the margins with respect to their power. You know, how we engage them, even in panel discussions like this, that provide a greater opportunity for them to articulate their own experiences and for us to recognize the expertise they hold in those spaces. You know, just thinking, you know, all the ways that we can show up in this work, but also in the cultivation of knowledge around this that, you know, invite us to consistently be moving the ball forward. Once we have the ability to make decisions, once we have the ability to, you know, make you know, sort of critical statements in the public and have them heard, that's the time when we need to make sure we are most deeply connected to our communities. That's something I learned from Manning Marable, who was my mentor and teacher for a very long time. And the first thing he taught me, when I entered his classroom was, don't think you're about to do this work about Black people without talking to Black people and engaging Black people. Like, if we are talking about movements forward and engaging in, using whatever positions of power we have to make sure that we are intrinsically linked to those who are also deeply interrogating power, just maybe from a different vantage point.
Mm-hmm. Cool, thank you. Shawnda, Connie, Shawn, Chi, anybody want to add?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I just wanted to say really quickly though that you guys, I don't think I warned you, but that, as you talk, I'm going to be sitting back to the side, snapping and doing this thing. So if you're watching the camera, I'm excited over here. So it's going to look that way because I'm not in person and I can't tell you how much I'm co-signing for all the things you're saying. So yeah, yes, Monique, yes, yes, all of you. One of the things that I sort of struggle with around this sort of personally and sort of intellectually, and you've heard me say this before, is the really sort of binary nature that we still hold the question in, right? And so it's like, it's how we hold the question, how we understand the problem. I feel like it keeps us trapped in a little bit of a box. So in one sense, we do, in that sort of intersectional way, we acknowledge gender sort of as one of those variables, in the same way that we have to acknowledge ability, that we have to acknowledge sexuality, that we have to acknowledge age. We make it seem as though sort of all we have to do is like sort of distinguish between either one. And I think that it still really does leave a lot of people out of the conversation. And to sort of Connie's point earlier about who gets to decide sort of who is a girl and who is a boy and what resources they get because of that designation, it makes real, like, we reify that sort of binary, we reify boy or girl, and we know that is leaving a huge swath of people out of the conversation. At one point, I did some interviews with children in sort of limited secure detention in New York City, and it wasn't lost on me that absolutely everyone, and I mean all of those kids, were gender nonconforming in some way, or they were LGBT identified. And it just made me really sort of understand that at the deepest ends of the system, these are the folks who we throw away. And so we just don't even know, like, girl, boy, but y'all, we don't know what the hell to do with y'all, right? And increasingly, I feel like our youth are letting us know that the sort of, either or definitions of straight or heterosexual or boy or girl don't lend themselves to how they see themselves at all. And so in that same way, we need to sort of advance beyond and really sort of, sort of take their leadership around that and sort of expand the way that we sort of are thinking about the problem and that we are discussing it. One of the things that happens is I start to think that we sort of support things and we genderize things that aren't necessarily gendered. Right. And then I think to Shai's point, one of the things that I think happens because of the way that we hold that question is that, it starts to, in that sort of reification, it removes boys and girls from relationship with each other. Right. We separate them, when they don't live separate lives. Right. And we have to come together sort of in our movements. Like I'm in relationship, I'm in community, I do movement work with people who don't identify as women as well. And there are ways that we sort of put our power together, because there are some issues that don't have much to do with that in a certain way. So I really just, I implore us to start to figure out a way to hold this question and to sort of disrupt the way that we're doing it.
Yeah, let me get Shawn and Connie and then Chi, and we'll open this up to the questions that are starting to appear in the Q&A box.
And so this is a powerful conversation. We'll reiterate how long overdue from our perspective and my perspective that this is, and just the intentionality of where do we go from here and how do we hold this, right? So we're having a 2-hour conversation today, but what is it in practice that we are going to hold ourselves accountable too, right? And I lift that up because, Fred, you know that finding alignment, even in the Black male achievement and boys and men of color space, has been a challenge, right? And so what are the vulnerabilities? How do we get out of our comfort zones and have these conversations? And then I think about where, because this is a national movement, a national conversation, global conversation, but where is a place that we can look at and say that these kinds of conversations are happening and that we are getting traction and it's happening, with this growth and there's learning, because I don't know where we would point to have that. So identifying a place where we can invite each other to be empathetic. Where are there are more invitations to be authentic in this conversation, and to say, look, we don't necessarily, I forgot who said it earlier, maybe it was Shawnda, is that we all know that we want our people to win, right? And how is it we are going to get there, right? That doesn't mean we will all agree, but we need to be able to, as long as we don't have a shared faith and shared analysis, it will be easy. You know, look, even in the boys and men of color space, us coming out with a collective statement has been a challenge, right? And so how do we be really intentional and get to a place where there's a collective shared analysis and voice around oppression and white supremacy, that, oh, wow, there's no more division, or there's less division between these factions, right? So I think that's a next step. And what do we do after this? What is the, we got some scholars, what are the position papers, and where are the, the challenges in philanthropy, and how are we not solely dependent upon philanthropy for catalyzing, I'll quote, my mother said back in March when the shutdown began that this was a fault line in humanity. And I thought that she was just reclaiming her 60s flower child, that was my, but, 6 months later, I believe, Mom, that this is a fault line in humanity. And what do we want to leave behind, right? And getting really, and how are we going to, what do we want to take forward? I think are the critical conversations. And, I think we have some respective work that we need to do in our space.
Yeah. Well, let me invite Connie and Shai. Any additional piece on this as we move toward what can we dream together? What does healing look like? What does creating a space to be empathetic, to be informed by the research, to get to the praxis that Monique talked about? So Connie, Shai, let's just, as we move this, and again, once you all finish, I have a couple questions in the Q&A box I'm gonna put on the table.
Sure thing. So a couple of thoughts that I have, I was like, taking these notes. I think the first step that we have to take is to actually agree on what it is that we live under first, right? And for me and the people that I work with, we understand that anti-Blackness is foundational to this entire world, right? And then we also understand that with that system and with that foundation, we understand that transphobia is a part of it. Heteronormativity is a part of it, right? Gender making is a part of that. So if we understand that, and xenophobia, white supremacy, right? But the centrality of anti-Blackness is critical to our framework. So I just want to say that, right? And if we can name that, then there are a couple thoughts that I have. One is that I think through, Fannie Lou Hamer's quote, which is, quote, "I don't want equal rights with the white man. If I did, I'd be a thief and a murderer." So the standards by which we've been operating has been too white. I just have to say it that way. It's been a little bit too white, and thus a little bit too violent. And so I think that we have to move away from trying to be, again, at their table and saying, "I don't want your table. Your table does damage," right? Your table has caused and is violence. And thus we have something else that we need to do, which includes getting rid of your table. So that's one piece of thing that I'm thinking about. And when I say, how do we get rid of their table as an analogy, I want us to think through how their table is made up of a whole bunch of institutions, right? So we need to really, really, I'm going to flag really quickly. I'm a part of Kaepernick's editorial team. We just produced this series, a month-long series. It's ongoing. We're still editing it, but it's called the Abolition for the People. And I think that's important because we're calling for the abolition of all of the tentacles that make up this anti-Black society. We're calling it the carceral system, but it doesn't end there, right? So to go back really quickly, agree on the system and the structure that we're all living under and how it impacts us. Decide collectively, we don't want what they're giving us. In fact, we're trying to destroy what they've made, right? And what it's done. And then the other thing we do is, how has it structured? What institutions have they constructed and that we are a part of that we want to get rid of, right? Even if we're occupying the seats, how do we collectively get rid of what you've done so that we can actually be free and liberated? And in doing that, I wanted to center the analysis of those who sit at the intersections of those institutions. So I think through, those who are disability justice folks. Most of them are Black, Indigenous, other communities of color who have been told they have disabilities, who many of whom have been sex workers, many of whom are trans, many of whom are gender nonconforming. Their point of departure and their analysis really is important. It's their analysis of what's happened that is very, very important to liberation and freedom. I think through, one of the things that my mentor and good friend, Miriam Kaba says is we have to try everything. So if trying everything means, being inside and blowing, sorry, this is recorded. If being inside means we help to implode certain things, then we do that. If being inside means we need to make it difficult for their agenda to continue, then we do that, right? And then we're always on the outside organizing, educating, studying, and coming together with somewhat of an agreement on what it is we want to get rid of and how it is we want to come together to be free.
Yeah, cool. Thank you, Connie. Yeah, Shy.
Ooh, Connie, I was over here like, girl, you just, you out here doing it, saying all of the things. And when you I said, ooh, would have caught me. I think the things, when I think about what we need to do moving forward, is this more conversations like this that are happening with us outside of the gaze of everyone else. What does it look like internally within our communities to say, what are the things that we need to do together so that we can move forward together, and expanding who gets to come into this space. Shawnda talking a little bit earlier about the youth being like, hey, I'm neither girl nor boy, I'm gender nonconforming. Like, how do we bring those voices into these types of spaces so that we're really hearing from the future exactly what it is that we need to do in the present to be able to move that work forward? So I think that's one of the first things that feels really powerful to me. I think the second thing is asking for what we're owed, right? Like, if we're going to destroy the system, absolutely, but we also deserve reparations and we deserve the things that we are owed, and we're not going to sacrifice those demands. And we're going to hold on to those demands, and we're going to make sure that we're talking about them consistently, that we're not wavering, that we're not out here making excuses, making compromises. There is no compromise when we're talking about justice and when we're talking about freedom and when we're talking about liberation. We don't want nobody's equity. We want to be liberated and we want to be free. And I think the last thing that feels so important is, where's the joy? I wore this Gwendolyn Brooks shirt and my favorite poem for her is like, we real cool. And I think so much about like all the joy that's in that space. And oftentimes when we talk about Black and brown folks, marginalized folks, we talk about ourselves and or we talk about others, right, from this community of pain and trauma rather than this space of joy that doesn't have to be rooted in this odd strength that you had to have because somebody did something to you. That's rooted in innovation, right? That comes out of dreaming and out of resting. That's not, oh, we had to create this thing because the system was in our face, but we got together collectively and we built this thing because it brought us joy. It brought us closer. It answered a question that we had as a community versus it answered a problem that was built for our community. So what does it look like for us to shift into those types of conversations? And I think the last thing I'll just add is, we got to triage, right? All of us can't be on the front lines, and which one of us get to dream, and which one of us get to have joy, and which one of us get to rest, and which one of us are on the front lines and are out here in these streets and are making the demands, and how do we get to rotate between all of these positions so that we don't end up burned out, so that we don't end up with one singular narrative that's telling the story of a multitude of collections of folks with a multitude of different identities, that with a multitude of different experiences, particularly as someone who's Gullah, who grew up, I tell people all the time, I think I saw my first white person when I was like 8. And I had like no idea. And I was like, this is strange. Like, what is happening here? But I also just grew up in a place where I grew up with an entirely different experience than most of the world, but in a space where I had so much joy, I had so much opportunity to dream and to think differently. I figured, I tell my grandma used to tell this story that I was convinced that genetics was related to cancer when I was younger, because we used to breed horses. And I was like, oh, look at this thing that's happening between these horses. I think that some diseases are like carried in your genes. And as like a elementary school kid, I'm telling my grandma this thing, but it's because I had all of this space to have joy and vision and dream and think, without all of these barriers and without all of these innovations. So I really, I think if we're talking about what we're moving forward and what we're carrying with us, I think those are the things that we need.
Yeah. Shai, thank you so much for putting us into this joy track, how we're dreaming, how we're thinking about it. You, as you were talking, you remind me very much of Zora Neale Hurston and, Their Eyes Were Watching God, and that, the narratives that, and in her own quote about, she's not, to paraphrase it, she's not out here, feeling all the suffering. She said, I'm sharpening my oyster knife. Like, I'm enjoying this, right? Let me read couple of the questions that are here, and then anybody who wants to respond to this, we can just kind of open this up for the next 20 minutes or so that we have. One person asked, if we open ourselves to freedom dreaming, this is kind of Shai where you were really helping us go. What will 2020 and beyond Black women and men coalitions look like? And what are some concrete thoughts, actions on how we should strategically and tactically operate? Second part of the question is, conversation will invariably ask the important question, what actions do we need to do? I think we've started to say some of that, and understand and implement and connect with potential allies of color. And one of our audience members asked, as a non-Black person of color, how do we advance racial and non-binary without diluting our fight against anti-Black racism? So question around dreaming, how do we move forward, what's strategic, what's tactical, and then as we include non-Black people of color in this, like, what is the best way to create those alliances, not allow the non-binary, or how to advance the racial non-binary without diluting anti-Black, work against anti-Black racism. So anybody want to jump in on that?
Can I, I'm going to try to take a stab at that.
Sure, please.
One of the things that I think about is, I'm a co-founder of an organization called AAPI Women Lead. And I've been thinking about this, and today I think I have an idea, which is that if you check out, one of the things that I think AAPI Women Lead is trying to do twofold is we highlight the ways in which Asians and Pacific Islander self-identified women and girls experience white supremacy, right? So we think about white supremacy, we think about xenophobia, and we think, of course, about heteronormativity and transphobia. But that is distinctly different from anti-Blackness, right? So we do two things, which is like, we need to call out white nationalism. We need to make sure we're not a part of white nationalism. We need to call out multicultural white nationalism. And we need to make sure that we highlight how white supremacy, white nationalism has impacted us. See Chinese virus, see, the Kung Fu virus, see, all the anti-Asian violence, and then of course, see the climate change and all the impacts of colonization upon Pacific Islander communities, right? So here we are, white supremacy. And then we also have another piece by which we think about anti-Blackness. And we talk about how the violence against us is predicated upon anti-Blackness. It's made possible through anti-Blackness, right? And then we talk about how we need to destroy anti-Blackness, right? Our own prescriptions to it in solidarity with Black people and Black communities across the globe, not only to save ourselves per se, but to know that we will not allow for that violence to be in our names, and we will not be in that right? So we won't prescribe to it. So those are two different things. And I've had a really hard and challenging time distinguishing between the two, but it's the labor that we have to participate in differentiating the two and knowing where our lines of solidarity exist. And when we talk about anti-Blackness, it can't be, oh, we're involved in anti-Black work because it'll save us. Because even if it didn't, you need to be involved in it, right? So it's not a self-interest. It's not because of self-interest, even though non-Black people may or may not be beneficiaries of the freedom of Black people. May or may not. You have to know that, because your existence is predicated upon anti-Blackness. So if you're okay with your existence being predicated upon that, then we have to have a separate conversation. It may not be in person, right? For your sake, right? However, I think we have to be very, very clear about the two, and also recognize, one of my very good friends and colleagues and mentors is a man named Frank Wilderson, and a man named Joan Costa Vargas, both of whom have written around anti-Blackness. And one of the things that Joan Costa Vargas said most recently in a talk, he was like, and I really hate to say this because I know the implications, but he says, in an anti-Black world, solidarity is a possibility, but it is not a necessity. So by that, non-Black people of color also have to recognize that while we are deeply impacted by white supremacy, our livelihoods are also predicated upon anti-Blackness. And so we are also there for the communities by whom, the lives, the bodies by whom our existence is based upon. And you may become an entirely different person, or you may not even be acknowledged. You may not even need to be here. And that's something you have to be okay with.
And be here in that struggle, that part of the struggle.
Yeah, and also because I think through that was a theoretical, but also a call to action. I think through all the organizing that I've done, and you have to take a step back. You come in when folks ask for you to come in. You take a step back when people want you to take a step back, right? So I'm here because Greg asked me to be here. I'm not gonna just jump in. You know what I mean? So I'm here. When community asks for me to be here. And if folks ever say to me, Connie, I don't ever want you a part of anything, then I have to think about that. And I have to think about who said it, but I really have to think about that. And that is a part of, I think, the quote unquote solidarity work.
Cool.
Connie,
Other thoughts? Yeah. Go ahead, Connie.
Really, just briefly to build on that, one of the things I have to think about often, and this is as a Black woman, is to think about sort of what, how are my experiences, my oppression, my privileges sort of defined in relationship to my proximity to Blackness or my proximity to whiteness, right? And I understand that as a lighter skinned Black woman, right? That there are privileges that I have walking around this world as a woman who is a fairer skinned than some other women. How do I understand my experiences, my privileges, and my oppression, in relationship to my proximity to straightness and proximity to my relationship to ability. So it's like, there's this continual thing that I feel like it's not just like you get to hold an identity and that's it. It's like, what's my proximity? Right. And not only what oppression does that allow me, what privileges does that offer? And sort of what is my responsibility sort of, to the work based upon all of those things. Right. And how do I leverage my privilege at any given time? Because I understand that I walk with it. Right. And, what does it mean? What am I doing with it? And so for me, a lot of it is like, one, doing that analysis continually sort of around what's your proximity to this, right? And sort of, and also now what's my responsibility sort of based upon what my privileges are.
I really like that. And I just want to say just one quick sentence. Thank you for reminding us of that and simplifying what the heck I just said, but also just thinking through the need to dismantle white supremacy and anti-Blackness as two separate projects, but coexisting. I think that clarity is super important.
I think part of that comes with also recognizing, I think part of that comes with also recognizing that there is tremendous wisdom in our young people. And if we engage with a participatory structure, I know people use that often as, you know, sort of a research term, or, you know, people in community don't necessarily use the frame around participatory engagement. But really, if you're doing it right, and you are centering the people at the you know, if your work is centering the people who are most impacted by your decisions, and that they then become the decision makers in this space, it shifts everything. And I think, you know, I understood that when I was 16 and, you know, started teaching at 16, right? You know, I think I experienced it, and it was something that stuck with me, you know, in ways that I think as adults, sometimes we forget, because again, just sort of going back to my, you know, I don't know if it was coherent musing about power, that, you know, once we amass a certain amount of it, sometimes we start to think, you know, that we are the ones that have all the answers, when in fact, knowledge is actually distributed. And if we go back to some of the models of learning and engagement that we have always known, then we become the young shies who can imagine something and who already know that something exists, even if she doesn't necessarily have the language to claim it just yet. When young people tell us that they are tired of our binaries, and that no longer aligns with how we have structured our, you know, grant making systems, or, you know, ways of framing justice and freedom, then instead of saying, well, we'll create a program that says X, Y, and Z, how about we just listen to the young people and structure, you know, sort of new ways of distributing resources that align with what they're doing. And I think there are organizations, foundations, you know, organizing mechanisms that are trying to do that, but not enough of us are doing that, because we're still stuck in a lot of ways in the language and framing that is most detrimental to our actual practice of freedom and dreaming. I also think that what we have to do as a people, what we have to probably do more intentionally is attack the narratives that conflate Blackness with criminality, Blackness, Indigenous identities, and other POC folks with criminality. I'm one who has studied, you know, juvenile justice, criminal justice for a very long time. And I think many of us have, and sort of going back to Shawn's point around the original intention of the Black men, the Campaign for Black Men and Boys, intentionally not being about criminal justice, is that there's this way that people think about Blackness as criminality, and only can talk about Blackness in the context of the carceral systems and other structures that you know, visibly oppress and keep people enslaved. And so I think what we have to do in our work is challenge some of those frameworks so that we can redefine Blackness as freedom dreaming, right? Redefine our engagement with young people as the participatory engagement of the wisdom of our youth, just as we say we prioritize and engage the wisdom of our elders. So, you know, that's just something that I think we don't want to get lost, because young people are brilliant.
Yeah. Monique and others, you have about 10 minutes left, and you just spoke to one of the questions that a good friend of ours, Donna Marie Wynn, offered. And when she says there is power in precision, in specificity, in laser-like foci. So how then do we call in a whole village in the midst of that precision? And I'm assuming you mean precision in terms of serving folks identify as males, folks identify as females, gender fluid, gender, you know, non-conforming family members. So one of the things I want to ask is, like, as we bring in this conversation to an end, what kind of ideas we have about that bringing the village in? Monique, you just started to get to it, this notion of authentic participatory engagement with younger folks who do already think of themselves differently than just race and these sort of binaries that we've sort of helped promote. We didn't create them, you know, per Connie's comment around systems in the state, but we are part of it. We do continue to promote them in many ways, whether consciously or unconsciously. So any other dreams, any other recommendations for philanthropy? We got about 10 minutes. Shawn, we'll go around the whole table. Shawn, you get the first crack at this, and then we'll close out.
Just say that this has been powerful. I'm on sensory overload, and I think a couple of things for next steps is, like, to Connie's point, how do we broaden the invitation? We only have 41 people on this call, right? and there is so much brilliance, right? I would recommend that the Executive Alliance, whoever's sponsoring, the co-sponsors, is there a way for us to transcribe this? We may have to edit a few things out. Connie can read over what she wants to be included. Talk about shared analysis, here's the beginnings of, I think, of a mini manifesto on how do we move forward, right? Because I have been just like blown away, and I'm just the joy piece and so many of the points. And as a point of departure, let's get this document, let's get this white paper, and how do we contribute to it? How do we use it as a catalyst for invitation and more conversation and adding on to it, right? So I worry about us missing or not maximizing this moment that we just had. So that's a concrete recommendation on all that we shared today.
Cool, thank you for that, Shawn. Yeah, Connie, let me ask you, any recommendations for how we should move forward? Any recommendations for philanthropy beyond what you've already indicated?
No, I think, I'm excited that, Dr. Morris is sitting at the helm of a relatively, not necessarily new, but a growing foundation. There's amazing leadership there, a lot of thought in that. So I would recommend that other foundations really listen and do the research and study the young people and that of what has come before us, right? I think we need to definitely really study. One of my colleagues also just said, per Dr. Morris's point, not necessarily around criminality, but Dr. Wilderson said yesterday, he was like, don't shame Black people, study Black rage, right? So I think that's really important in terms of studying where the rage is coming from and as a point of analysis for what to do next. Right. And when he was talking about shame, he was talking about shaming people for not voting, all that stuff. Right. Study why people are not voting to begin with before we even try to shame or dictate.
Yeah. So cool. Thank you for that. Shawnda, how would you, any recommendations on how to move forward? Any recommendations for philanthropy? You're still muted. Let's see.
How's that? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Mic check. 1 2 1 2. We were all right.
On the ones and twos, so 50.
So much of first of all, this has lifted me, and I'm heartened and hopeful, just by the conversation. So I'm really excited to continue the conversation with all of you, sort of in that spirit. So much of what I think I would recommend has to do with proximity. And so continuing to sort of create space sort of internally by bringing people together like us who are interested in sort of serving youth of color and making sure that they have what they need. Again, to Monique's point, making sure that youth have the space to be proximate to each other. And for me, sort of how I operationalize that, when I think about certain pieces of programming that I'm supporting, even though I work for a women's organization, a feminist organization, there are places where what youth need the most is to be around each other, sort of regardless of any one of their identities. And so figuring out sort of what are the things that we can sort of support, we can put in place that allow them to be there, be that, a research intensive or organizing training, such that they all have the tools that they need to go out into this world and fight the oppression that we all, deal with, because they're going to be the ones to do it. Also, again, expanding our concepts of gender again. And I know the work that gets done in sort of, women and girl spaces, but I want my brothers to be out there really sort of promoting this and to be able to sort of expand sort of what it means to be a boy and who gets to call themselves that. And so I think that I want to hear more about it. It could be happening, but I want to hear more about that work. And I want to see a lot more resources sort of going toward that effort. Yeah, that's it. I want us to stay in conversation. I want to get that white paper out the door. I keep telling y'all that I make really good cornbread and greens and other things. And, you know, there's a reason for us to make this happen.
We keep hearing about this, but we ain't had none. Like, Shawnda, thank you so much for that. Let me ask Shy, if you any last comment, recommendations, any other dream talk you want to put out there, anything else? Did we lose Shy? Monique, how about you?
Yeah.
Any closing.
So Tia Oros-Peters is on the advisory committee for Grantmakers for Girls of Color, and she always leads with this notion of being a good ancestor. And I think whenever I see that call, either if it's at the end of an email that she sends or on Facebook, it says, be a good ancestor. I think, you know, that we call upon our ancestors, we look to our ancestors for what they provided for us in so many ways, that part of what that means for me is that I have to continue, and I think we should collectively continue to deeply interrogate power. We should interrogate our own individual power, our collective power, how we use it and how we distribute it. Power is meant to be shared, in my mind. And just as knowledge is shared, expertise is shared. So I think, you know, that to me is part of how we move forward. Also, we're gonna call this thing a black paper that we create.
Amen to that.
Look, a couple last things. One, thank you all so much for the conversation. It really goes to something that Donna Marie said too in her question. You know, how many times do we need to relearn that those left outside the village will burn it down to feel its warmth? And so our young folks, you know, they're not waiting around. You know, and as those of us who are working with younger folks, working with our elders, you know, as we become elders, thinking about, well, how do we do this work? And I love this from Michael Graham. I think it's from Michael, but somebody said, sorry, Donna Marie, people who stopped listening to his youth, stopped listening to its wisest elders long ago. So I want to thank all of you for being on with us today. We got some great suggestions. We see this at the Executive Alliance as not a one-off conversation, but this is going to become a part of our work. So you'll be hearing more from us about that. I want to thank our co-sponsors, the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color, the Rosenberg Foundation, and Funders for Justice for this conversation. And again, I want to thank Shawn, Connie, Monique, Chi, and Shawnda for the work that you're doing and for spending a little bit of time having this conversation today. So thank you all very much. Stay healthy, stay strong in this next period of time as we do the work on behalf of our communities. And we'll see you soon. Thank you all very much, and have a great rest of your day.